because it just takes too much work to maintain soil in good enough quality to grow vegetables on a really large scale. So I have this feeling that we've used up a lot of the good soil in this spread from east to west in the US. We can rehabilitate it, we know how to do that, we just haven't been doing it. So, okay, we've used up the whole planet, and where else do we go? You know, I'm intrigued also by the fact that we got to the moon in the 1960s and we've never been back. You know, it takes a lot of work to get to other planets, so I think the option of moving somewhere else because we're done here probably isn't going to happen. So things did change though in the 1970s. You know, a lot of people were predicting by the 1970s global famine, and we weren't going to have enough food to feed the world, and a lot of people were going to starve. That was when we figured out how to turn oil into food. And it allowed probably another 2 billion people to come onto the planet who probably wouldn't have been born without that, the Green Revolution as it was called, which was really the development of crops with high fertilizer response genes. With a lot of heirloom crops, you can feed them a certain amount of fertilizer and they'll get so big and grow so fast. You feed them more fertilizer, they're pretty well maxed out. They don't really get a lot more growth. But they have now, in the 1960s and 70s, bred crops that responded to much higher doses of fertilizer with much faster and larger growth. And that was what the Green Revolution was really based on, was breeding crops that had high fertilizer response genes. So it allowed far more food to be grown using a lot of oil to create the fertilizers and also the pesticides that were required by these fast-growing crops, because crops that have a lot of chemical fertilizers in them kind of put out a little signal to bugs that, hey, I got a lot of minerals in me, I'm really tasty food, and the bugs come in and grab them. That's part of why chemical fertilizing and pesticides go hand in hand. There are a lot of reasons, but that's one of them, is bugs really like nitrogen-pumped food. So if you look at world wheat production, this is 1950 on the left, those of you who can't see the numbers, and the year 2000 on the right, this huge boom in world wheat production as we learned how to turn oil into food. And just to show you a similar graph, here's world oil production going up over the same length of time. So they're pretty much in lockstep with one another. And a graph of world population also goes up about the same way. So this discovery of turning oil into food was a huge, huge piece for us. Here's the Green Revolution today. This is a field in India that was farmed using Green Revolution techniques for about 25 years until the subsidies ran out. The Indian government became too poor to be able to pay the huge cost. They were no longer being subsidized by the industrialized nations. And this is a completely salted up field. The salt goes all the way down. And the only way to clean up salted soil like that is lots and lots of fresh water. And they don't, well, there are several ways, but it takes a lot of work. And they don't have a lot of fresh water there, so it's not going to happen. This little graph, those of you who are peak oil fans, and this is essentially the graph of world oil production. We're just in this enormous spike, and we're now, a lot of people feel, at the peak of it, or somewhere near the peak of it. You know, we may be 5 years from it, we may be at it, we may be 30 years from it, but I think particularly people in Texas know that oil is a non-renewable resource and it's not going to last forever. So we have some interesting decisions to make at this point of how do we transition. And one of my mentors, a guy named David Holmgren, was the co-founder of the whole idea of permaculture, which is something that I do and I'm going to talk more about in a few minutes. Looked at several different possible scenarios as we transition out of oil to something else. And there's what he calls the techno-fantasy. Obviously you can see what his opinion of it is, but this is without the label. It's the idea that we're going to discover something else to replace oil. It's the saying that a lot of people use, that, you know, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And that's what folks are saying, some folks are saying about the oil age, is we're going to end because it's going to end because we'll find something different. So that's the techno-fantasy model in Holmgren's terms. Then there's the green tech stability, where we will transition to solar panels and renewables and all the things that folks are talking about here, and we'll drop a little bit, and then we'll kind of stabilize. And that's definitely one scenario, and one that would involve not such a bumpy ride. Then there's what Holmgren thinks, and a lot of permaculture related people think is liable to happen, which is this creative descent where we will come back down from this kind of crazy peak of, well, they say the Earth's population should peak at about 9.3 billion or so, and then start coming back down. And that graph kind of follows that scenario. And then the red line is the Atlantis, the kind of uh-oh scenario that I think none of us want to see, or hopefully none of us want to see. I don't like envisioning that kind of scenario. So these are possibilities. Probably somewhere in here is our future. And I think we're all hoping for something in this range, the green tech to the creative descent scenario. We've actually been through something, human beings have been through something like this before in the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was a time in the world, mostly in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean, of great culture, very high culture, and bronze is a tremendous metal, really, really useful. It doesn't rust, it holds a pretty good edge, it's really formable and malleable. And the Bronze Age just ended with a kind of a dark age, and then things picked up again a few centuries later, but there was a long dark age at the end of the Bronze Age, and archaeologists have wondered, how come? Why did the Bronze Age end? And one of the possibilities is what people call peak wood. Because the way you make bronze, okay, here's a plow, it's about 1 kilogram of bronze, or so 2.2 pounds of bronze. In order to smelt using traditional methods, wood-based methods, which is how people did it until the coal age, you need to take 4 or 5 trees of this size. Okay, this is a 60 to 100-year-old tree. It's about a cubic meter of wood by the time you've taken all the usable wood off of it. To make 1 kilogram of bronze, you take 5 or 6 of those trees, you stack them up, you pile dirt on them, and then you set fire to them and you make charcoal. You smolder this wood with lack of oxygen, make charcoal, and then use the charcoal to smelt the bronze because it burns at a higher temperature than wood does. But it takes 5 to 6 cubic meters or 5 to 6 big old trees to make one plow. So this belt buckle I've got, which is a pretty hefty belt buckle, is probably 1 tree's worth of charcoal to make a belt buckle this size. So we're really lucky in having oil. A tablespoon of oil, the energy in that is the same amount of energy as a pretty strong person working all day long. That's how much energy is in a tablespoon of oil. So we've been remarkably fortunate in not having to do it this way. And they feel that the Bronze Age may have ended because they cut down all the trees. It doesn't take very long when you're making a lot of bronze to cut down everything. So, we've got landfills all over the country, all over the world, stacking up. We've got collapse of infrastructure, bridges falling down, potholes we can't fix. We've got huge soil erosion and soil loss. We've got global warming. Take your pick, the list can go on and on and on. With this idea that agriculture may not be sustainable, what are we going to do? Where do we go with this? And this is where the stuff that I've been involved in for the last 20 years, permaculture, I think can come to the rescue. Because permaculture uses ideas from agriculture, uses ideas from horticulture, gardening. It's really a design approach just based on evaluating all the possible tools that are out there and choosing which one is going to work best in your situation. It's very site-specific and culture-specific. And it's essentially a really good decision-making tool. And these are some of my favorite permaculture sites, places that use natural building, renewable technologies, regenerative technologies even. So I want to go through a little bit of why I think permaculture can offer us some solutions here. I mentioned very briefly this idea of horticultural societies, not farming societies, and not hunter-gatherer societies either. So what do I mean by that? Horticulture comes from the word hortus, for plant, as opposed to agere, which is the word for field. So right there we're looking at, it's a very different way of looking at working with plants and animals, that we're working with the being themselves rather than transforming the landscape. The simple definition is it's gardening rather than farming. It's smaller scale, the tools are simpler, hand tools rather than plows. Plowing is a hallmark of agriculture, and I think a lot of folks here recognize that tillage is an enormous problem in the disturbance of the soil life and loss of topsoil. So finding tools that don't destroy the soil. It's usually done on a small scale, and it's with mixed crops rather than large monocultures. It encourages the natural process of succession, which is in a place that has enough rainfall, it's that